The moment the wine touched her tongue, Grace Palmer knew something was wrong. It tasted sharp, bitter, like metal mixed with something burning. She had only meant to take one small sip. Her throat had been dry for hours, her head was spinning from working a double shift, and the goblet on her tray looked exactly like the water cups the kitchen staff used. One sip, that was all, and now her stomach felt like it was folding in on itself. The grand hall of the Silver Pine Hotel went silent around her. 200 guests in dark suits and glittering gowns turned their heads at the sound of the silver goblet hitting the marble floor. The ringing echo seemed to last forever. Grace pressed her hand against her stomach and tried to breathe, but the pain climbed up her chest like fire crawling through dry grass. She looked up, and her eyes met his. Damon Cross, the man the entire city whispered about, the man they called the Alpha King. He sat at the head of the long table, dressed in black. His gray eyes locked on her with an expression she could not read. Not anger, not shock, something colder. Something that understood exactly what was happening to her before she did. Because the goblet she had just drunk from was his. Grace had worked at the Silver Pine for 3 years. She knew the rules for private events like this one. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look the guests in the eye. Do not touch anything on the head table. And tonight, one rule had been repeated to the staff 5 separate times before the doors opened. Do not go near the king's cup. The head waiter had said it with sweat on his forehead. Grace had thought it was strange at the time. Now, as her legs gave out beneath her and the ceiling lights blurred into white smears, she understood. The cup was never supposed to be touched because someone knew what was inside it. She hit the floor hard. Somewhere far away, a woman screamed. Chairs scraped back. Heavy boots pounded across the marble. Grace tried to speak, tried to say she was sorry, that it was a mistake, that she only wanted water, but her tongue felt thick and useless. The fire in her stomach spread into her veins, and every heartbeat pushed it further through her body. This is it, she thought. I am going to die on this floor in a uniform that does not even fit me. And no one will ever know my name. Grace had no family to call. She had grown up in a children's home on the east side of the city, left there as a baby with nothing but a blanket and a small silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. No note, no name. The staff at the home had named her Grace because she never cried, not even as an infant. She had aged out at 18, taken the first job she could find, and spent the next 6 years keeping her head down, paying her rent, and telling herself that a quiet life was enough. A quiet life. The thought almost made her laugh, as the poison burned through her. Strong hands grabbed her shoulders. A guard, huge and rough, hauled her up like she weighed nothing. His voice boomed above her head. She poisoned the cup. Seize her. She is the assassin. No. Grace tried to say. No, I drank it. Why would I drink it if I put poison in it? But the words came out as a broken whisper that no one heard. The room spun. Faces swirled around her. Angry faces, frightened faces, faces that looked at her like she was a criminal caught in the act. The guard's grip tightened until her arms ached, and he began dragging her toward the doors. Then a single word cut through the chaos like a blade. Stop. The room froze. The guard froze. Even the pain in Grace's body seemed to pause for one impossible second. Damon Cross had risen from his chair. He did not shout. He did not need to. His voice carried a weight that pressed down on every person in that hall, and Grace felt it in her bones even through the haze of the poison. He walked toward her slowly, and the crowd parted for him the way water parts around a ship. He stopped in front of her. Up close, he was taller than she expected, and his eyes were not just gray. They had a ring of silver around the center, bright and strange, like moonlight trapped in glass. He looked at her face, then at the fallen goblet, then back at her face. Something flickered in his expression. She drank it, he said quietly. He turned to the room, and his voice hardened. She drank from my cup, which means the poison inside it was meant for me, and she is the only reason I am still standing here. Gasps rippled through the hall. Grace saw the guests exchange glances, saw hands cover mouths, saw one older man at the far end of the table go very pale and very still. The guard holding Grace stammered, "My king." She could still be involved. Perhaps she drank it by accident while planting it. We should question her. She will be dead in 10 minutes if we stand here talking, Damon said. His eyes never left Grace's face. Wolfsbane works fast. Wolfsbane. The word meant nothing to Grace. but the way he said it made her blood run colder than the poison already had. Her vision was going dark at the edges now, closing in like curtains at the end of a play. Her legs stopped holding her entirely, and she felt herself falling again. She never hit the floor. Damon Cross caught her. The Alpha King, the most feared man in the city, caught a collapsing waitress in his arms, in front of 200 of the most powerful people in the country, and he did not hesitate for even a heartbeat. Grace felt the warmth of him through the fire in her veins, and for a reason she could not explain, the pain eased just slightly, as if her body recognized something her mind did not. "Get Dr. Hart," Damon ordered. "Now, clear the West Wing, and lock every door in this building. No one leaves until I know who prepared that cup." The last thing Grace heard before the darkness took her was his voice, low and close to her ear, meant for her alone. "Stay awake," he said. "Whatever you do, do not let go." She tried. She truly tried. But the darkness was stronger, and it pulled her under like a wave. In the darkness, Grace dreamed. She dreamed of a forest she had never seen, tall pines heavy with snow, and a woman's voice singing somewhere far away. She dreamed of running on 4 legs instead of 2, of the ground flying beneath her, of a moon so large and bright it filled half the sky. She dreamed of the silver pendant she had worn her whole life, except in the dream it was not a pendant. It was a mark, glowing softly on the inside of her wrist, shaped like a crescent moon. And she dreamed of a voice, deep and old, speaking words she somehow understood. "You were hidden for a reason, child, and now they have found you." Somewhere between the dream and the dark, Grace felt her heart stop. She felt it clearly, the way you feel a clock stop ticking in a quiet room. 1 beat, then nothing. Then silence, stretching out like a black ocean. And then, from somewhere deep inside her, deeper than muscle and bone, something answered the silence. Something that had been asleep her entire life, opened one eye in the dark. Something that refused, absolutely refused, to let her die on this night. Her heart slammed back to life so hard it hurt. Far above her, in the world of light and sound, a gray-haired man in a long coat stumbled backward from the bed where she lay, his medical bag falling from his hands. Dr. Edwin Hart had treated poison cases for 40 years. He had watched wolfsbane end lives in minutes. He had never once seen a heart restart on its own. He turned to the doorway, where Damon Cross stood watching, his arms crossed, his silver-ringed eyes fixed on the unconscious girl. "My king," the doctor whispered. "This is not possible. That dose would have ended anyone. Any human, at least." Damon said nothing for a long moment. He walked to the bedside and looked down at the waitress with the pale face and the dark hair spread across the pillow. Her breathing had steadied. The gray tint was fading from her skin. On her wrist, so faint that only eyes like his could see it, a thin crescent-shaped mark glimmered and then vanished. "Any human," Damon repeated softly. "Yes, doctor. That is exactly the point." He reached down and gently turned her wrist toward the light, studying the place where the mark had appeared. His jaw tightened. "Watch her," he said. "Tell no one what you saw tonight. No one. If anyone asks, she survived because the dose was weak." The doctor swallowed. "And if she wakes and asks what happened to her?" Damon looked at Grace's sleeping face one last time, before turning toward the door. "Then she asks me," he said, "because whoever this girl is, she just drank a poison brewed to end my life, and her body burned it away like it was nothing. There are only a handful of bloodlines in the world that could survive that." He paused at the doorway, and his voice dropped so low the doctor barely caught the words. "And every single one of them is supposed to be gone." The door closed. The lamp flickered. And in the quiet room, Grace Palmer slept on, unaware that her one small sip had just cracked open a secret buried for 20 years. Unaware that the most dangerous man in the country now could not stop thinking about her. And unaware that somewhere in that locked hotel, the person who had poisoned the cup was already planning how to finish what they had started. Grace woke to the smell of lavender and the sound of rain against glass. For one confused moment, she thought she was back in her tiny apartment, late for her shift. Then she opened her eyes and saw the ceiling, high and white with gold trim, and a chandelier hanging above her like a frozen waterfall, and she knew she was somewhere she did not belong. She sat up too fast. Her head swam, but the fire in her stomach was gone. replaced by a dull, distant ache. She was in a bed larger than her entire bedroom at home, wearing a soft white nightgown that was not hers. Tall windows lined one wall, streaked with rain. Beyond them stretched gardens she had only ever seen in magazines. 3 days, said a voice from the corner. Grace jumped. The gray-haired doctor sat in an armchair by the window, a book closed on his lap, watching her with careful eyes. "You have been asleep for 3 days, he said. "I am Dr. Hart. How do you feel?" 3 days. The words did not make sense. Grace pressed her hand to her stomach, remembering the bitter wine, the marble floor, the silver-eyed man catching her as she fell. "I should be dead," she said quietly. It was not a question. "Yes," the doctor said. "You should be." He stood, poured a glass of water from a pitcher, and handed it to her. She stared at it and did not drink. He noticed, and gave a small, sad smile. "It is only water, I promise. You are safe here." "Where is here?" "The private residence of Damon Cross. You are in the guest wing of his estate. He had you moved from the hotel the night you collapsed." Grace's fingers tightened around the glass. Everyone in the city knew that name. Damon Cross owned half the buildings downtown. His family had run this region for generations, and the newspapers spoke about him carefully, the way people speak about storms. There were other stories too, whispered ones, stories about his family and the families around him, stories about people who were more than people. Grace had always dismissed those as nonsense. "Why did the poison not work on me?" she asked. Dr. Hart's face changed. He glanced at the door, then back at her, and lowered himself onto the edge of a chair near the bed. "What do you know about your parents?" he asked gently. "Nothing. I was left at a children's home as a baby. Why does that matter?" "Because the poison in that cup was wolfsbane," he said. "It is not an ordinary poison. It is made for one purpose only, and it does not harm ordinary people the way it harmed you. It burns them, yes, but it ends them quickly and quietly. What it did to you, the fire, the fight, the survival, that only happens to someone whose blood is not entirely ordinary." Grace stared at him. Somewhere deep in her chest, something stirred. The same something that had opened its eye in the darkness while her heart stood still. "You are saying I am not ordinary." "I am saying," the doctor replied carefully, "that you survived something no ordinary person has ever survived. And in this house, that fact makes you either very valuable or very dangerous, depending on who is asking." Before Grace could respond, the door opened. Damon Cross filled the doorway the way thunder fills a sky. He wore a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled, and his silver-ringed eyes went straight to her, sweeping over her face as if checking her against a memory. Dr. Hart rose immediately, gave a small bow, and slipped out of the room without a word. The door clicked shut behind him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped the windows. Grace pulled the blanket a little higher, feeling small and out of place, but she refused to look away from him. She had spent her whole life being invisible. She was not going to shrink now. "You are awake," he finally said. "Good. You could have just sent flowers," Grace said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Most people do that when someone almost dies at their party. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or the ghost of a smile. He crossed the room and stood at the foot of the bed. "Do you know what you drank?" he asked. "Poison. Meant for you." "Wolfsbane," he said. "Enough to end me 3 times over. Someone inside my own circle put it there. Someone who knew exactly which cup would reach my hand, which means someone close to me, someone trusted, wants me gone. And you, Grace Palmer, are the only person alive who touched that cup after it was poisoned and lived to speak about it." Grace felt her stomach drop. "You think I saw something?" "I think you are a witness whether you like it or not," Damon said. "The person who did this knows you survived. They know you were behind the service doors, in the kitchens, in the halls where they had to walk to reach that cup. They do not know what you saw or did not see, and people like that do not leave questions unanswered." The rain seemed louder suddenly. Grace thought of her small apartment, her quiet life, her locked door that suddenly felt as thin as paper. "So what happens to me now?" she asked. "You stay here," he said, "under my protection, until I find them." "And if I refuse?" Damon looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, almost tired. "Then you walk out that door, and I give you 2 days, maybe 3. These people removed an entire bloodline from the world once, and made it look like an accident. A waitress from the east side would not even make the morning paper. An entire bloodline. The words snagged on something inside her, some thread she could not see the end of. Grace looked down at her hands, at the thin silver chain still around her neck, the crescent moon pendant resting against the white nightgown, the only thing her unknown mother had ever given her. When she looked up, Damon's eyes were fixed on the pendant. His whole body had gone still, the way a forest goes still before a storm. The silver ring around his gray eyes seemed to brighten. "Where did you get that?" he asked. His voice was different now. Careful, almost afraid. "It is mine," Grace said, closing her hand around it. "It is the only thing that is mine." "Why?" For a moment, she thought he would not answer. Then he turned toward the window, watching the rain flood the gardens, and when he spoke, it was so quiet she barely heard him. "Because I have seen that mark before," he said, "a long time ago, on people who no longer exist." He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the handle. "Rest," he said. "Eat. Dr. Hart will check on you tonight. Tomorrow you will tell me everything you remember from the banquet, every face, every voice, every person who walked past that table. And Grace." She looked up. "Do not show that pendant to anyone else in this house," he said. "Not the staff, not the guests, no one. If anyone asks about your family, you have none. If anyone asks how you survived, the dose was weak. Do you understand?" "I do not understand anything," Grace said honestly. "That," Damon said, "is the only thing keeping you safe right now." Then he was gone, and Grace sat alone in the enormous bed, her heart pounding, her fist clenched around a small silver moon that had suddenly become the most dangerous thing she owned. That night, she could not sleep. She stood at the tall window, watching lightning move over the distant hills, and twice, far out in the dark gardens, she thought she saw shapes moving between the trees. Large shapes, low to the ground, fast and silent. She told herself they were dogs, guard dogs, surely, on an estate like this. But dogs did not stop and look up at her window. Dogs did not have eyes that caught the lightning and flashed silver, exactly like his. Grace stepped back from the glass, pulse racing, and pulled the curtain closed. Behind her, in the mirror above the dresser, her own reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed. And for half a second, half a heartbeat, so fast she could have imagined it, her reflection's eyes flashed silver too. Down the hall, in a study lined with old books, Damon Cross poured a drink he did not touch and stared at a locked drawer in his desk. Inside that drawer was a file 20 years old, a file his father had ordered burned, a file Damon had kept anyway. On its cover was a single word, the name of a family that history had erased, and beneath the name, stamped in fading ink, was a small crescent moon, identical to the one hanging around the neck of the waitress sleeping in his guest wing. "It cannot be," he murmured to the empty room. "They are gone." We made sure they were gone. But his hands were not steady as he unlocked the drawer, and outside, deep in the storm-soaked woods, something lifted its head and howled, long and low, as if it already knew the truth. The questioning began the next morning, but it was not what Grace expected. There was no dark room, no bright lamp, no hard chair. Instead, a maid led her to a sunlit library, where breakfast waited on a small table, and Damon Cross sat across from her with a notebook he never opened, asking questions in a voice that was almost gentle. Who poured the wine? Who carried the trays? Who entered the kitchens between 7 and 9? Which guests left their seats? Which guards changed positions? Grace answered everything she could. She had a good memory, better than most, sharpened by years of remembering orders for tables of 12, without writing anything down. She described the nervous head waiter, the delivery man who came late, the tall woman in the green dress who had wandered near the service corridor twice. Damon listened to all of it without moving, his eyes never leaving her face, and Grace had the strange feeling he was studying two things at once, her words and her. Then she mentioned the older man at the end of the head table, the one who had gone pale when Damon announced the poison. The gray-haired man with the ring, she said. Gold ring, red stone, left hand. When you said the word wolfsbane, everyone else gasped. He did not. He just went white and stared at his plate. People gasp when they are surprised. He looked like a man who was doing math. For the first time that morning, Damon moved. He leaned back slowly, and something dangerous passed behind his eyes. "You are certain," he said. "I stood 8 feet from him for 4 hours," Grace said. "I am certain." "That man," Damon said quietly, "is Victor Lane, my second in command. My father trusted him. I have trusted him my entire life. He has keys to every building I own, including the hotel." The room felt suddenly cold. Grace set down her cup. "Then why are you telling me this?" she asked. "If he did this, why tell the waitress?" "Because you are the only person in this house I know is innocent," Damon said. "You drank the poison. Everyone else here could have poured it." It was a strange thing, being trusted by a man like him. Stranger still was how the days that followed began to change shape around her. Grace had expected to be a prisoner, and in a way she was. But the cage was made of silk. She was given clothes finer than anything she had ever touched, meals that appeared like magic, and freedom to walk the endless halls. The staff treated her with careful politeness, and watched her with open curiosity. The whispers followed her everywhere. The waitress, the girl who drank the king's cup, the girl who did not die. She learned quickly that the estate was its own world with its own royalty, and its queen, in every way but title, was a woman named Helen Marsh. Grace met her on the 4th day, in the long gallery lined with paintings. Helen was beautiful, the way winter is beautiful, pale and gold and cold, dressed in cream silk, with a smile that never reached her eyes. Everyone said she and Damon would marry. Their families had planned it for decades. She stopped in front of Grace, looked her up and down slowly, and let the silence stretch until it hurt. "So you are the little accident," Helen said at last. "The whole city is talking about you. The brave girl who saved Damon's life. Tell me, did you know it was his cup when you drank from it?" "I thought it was water," Grace said evenly. Helen laughed softly. "Of course you did." She stepped closer, and her voice dropped, sweet as syrup and twice as sticky. "Let me give you some advice. From one woman to another. This world you have fallen into has rules older than that pendant you hide under your collar. People here are not what they seem, and girls who wander into the woods tend to get lost in them. Enjoy the nice clothes, eat the nice food, and when Damon finds his traitor, go back to your little life and forget every single thing you saw here. That is how you stay safe." She swept away down the gallery, perfume trailing behind her, and Grace stood frozen in front of a painting of a forest under a full moon, her heart hammering for reasons she could not name. Helen had mentioned the pendant. The pendant no one was supposed to know about. The pendant Grace had kept hidden under her collar every single day. Which meant someone was watching her closely enough to see it, or someone had searched her room. That night, Grace checked her belongings and found the truth. Her old uniform, the one she had worn the night of the banquet, had been unfolded and refolded wrong. The lining of the collar was torn open a half-inch, as if quick fingers had searched for something sewn inside. Whoever it was had found nothing, because Grace had never once taken the pendant off. She sat on the edge of the bed with her blood roaring in her ears, and she made a decision. If she was trapped in a game, she would stop playing it blind. The estate had a library, and the library had history books, and history, Grace discovered, had holes in it. She spent the next 3 evenings reading everything she could find about the great families of the region. The Cross family filled entire shelves. Other names appeared again and again. Lane, Marsh, half a dozen more. But in book after book, she found the same strange gap. 20 years ago, something had happened in the northern forests. Every book approached it, and then swerved around it, the way people swerve around a hole in the road. A tragedy, one called it. A fire, said another. The end of the northern line, said a third, and then simply moved on, as if an entire family vanishing was a footnote. The northern line. In one old book, water damaged and shoved behind the others, Grace finally found a name. The Ashford family, keepers of the Northern Territory, and beneath the family name, printed as their ancient seal, was a crescent moon. Her crescent moon. Line for line, curve for curve, identical to the pendant that had hung around her neck since before she could speak. Grace's hands shook as she turned the page. There was a photograph, grainy and old, of a family standing in front of a great timber house, a tall man with kind eyes, a dark-haired woman, laughing at something outside the frame, and in the woman's arms, wrapped in a pale blanket, a baby. The caption read, "The Ashford family, 1 year before the Northern tragedy, all perished. All perished." Grace stared at the dark-haired woman, at the shape of her smile, at the eyes that looked, even in a ruined old photograph, exactly like the eyes Grace saw in the mirror every morning of her life. The library door opened behind her. Grace slammed the book shut and turned. Dr. Hart stood in the doorway, a lamp in his hand, and when his gaze fell on the book she was holding, all the color drained from his face. He stepped inside quickly and closed the door. "Where did you find that?" he whispered. "On the shelf. Doctor, who were the Ashfords?" "Put it back," he said. "Please. If anyone sees you with that book, if anyone even suspects you have read it, then everything the king is doing to keep you breathing will not matter." Grace stood her ground. "The woman in this photograph looks like me," she said. "The baby in this photograph was never found, was she? The book says all perished. But books lie. And someone left a baby at a children's home 24 years ago with nothing but a blanket and this." She pulled the pendant out from under her collar. The silver crescent caught the lamplight and glowed. Dr. Hart stared at it the way a man stares at a ghost. Then, very slowly, he sank into a chair, and his voice, when it came, was barely a breath. 20 years ago, he said, I was a young physician in the Northern Territory. I served the Ashford family. I was there the week of the fire. And I will tell you the one thing I have never told a living soul." He looked up at her, and his eyes were wet. The night everything burned, the child's room was already empty. Someone had taken the baby out before it began. Someone knew what was coming. Grace's legs went weak. She gripped the table. "Doctor," she whispered, "whose cup did I drink from? Whose family did this? Who burned the North?" The old man opened his mouth to answer, and in the hallway outside, a floorboard creaked, soft and deliberate, the sound of someone who had been standing there for a long time, listening, and had just now decided to walk away. Dr. Hart heard the floorboard too. He was on his feet in an instant, faster than a man his age had any right to move, and he blew out the lamp. Darkness swallowed the library. Grace felt his hand grip her wrist in the black. "Not another word," he breathed. "Not here. The walls in this house have ears, and tonight one of them was listening." He guided her through the dark shelves to a second door she had not known existed, a narrow servant's passage that smelled of dust and old wood. They moved through it in silence, twisting left and right, until he stopped at a seam in the wall and pushed. The panel opened into the corridor outside her own room. "Go inside," he whispered. "Lock the door. Tomorrow, act as if tonight never happened. Smile at the staff. Ignore the books. And whatever you do, stay away from Victor Lane." "You did not answer my question," Grace whispered back. The old man's face was gray in the moonlight from the corridor window. "Because the answer will break your heart, child," he said. "And a broken heart makes people reckless, and reckless people in this house do not live long. Give me time. There is a way to prove what you are, prove it beyond doubt, and until I have that proof, a guess will only get us both buried." He was gone before she could argue, vanishing back into the wall like a ghost. Grace barely slept, and in the morning, everything changed again, because Damon Cross came to her door himself and said 5 words she never expected. "Walk with me, please." They walked the gardens in the cold morning light, past fountains and hedges heavy with rain, 2 guards trailing far behind. For a long while, Damon said nothing at all. Grace watched him from the corner of her eye, and noticed things she had not let herself notice before. The shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way he positioned himself, always, between her and the tree line, like a wall that had decided on its own where to stand. "You have not asked me the question," he finally said. "Everyone asks eventually. You have been here almost 2 weeks and you have never asked." "Which question?" He stopped walking and turned to face her. "The stories about my family," he said. "About the families in this region, the old stories. You have heard them your whole life. Everyone in the city has. You saw something in the gardens your first night here. Dr. Hart tells me you have been reading. You are not a stupid woman, Grace, so ask me." Grace's mouth went dry. The shapes in the dark, the eyes that flashed silver, the word wolfsbane, a poison made for one purpose only. "The stories are true," she said quietly. It was not a question. "Aren't they?" "Yes," Damon said. The world tilted. Grace had expected to feel terror, and somewhere far away she did, but the feeling that rose up first, absurdly, overwhelmingly, was relief. Relief, because her entire life she had felt like a stranger inside her own skin, like a door in her chest that would not open, like something pacing behind her ribs on nights when the moon was full. She had thought she was broken. She was not broken. She was something else. And the poison did not end me, she said slowly, because whatever your family is, whatever this whole hidden world is, I am part of it too. Yes, Damon said again, softer. The Ashfords, Grace said, the Northern family. That is what you saw when you looked at my pendant. That is why you told me to hide it. Damon went very still. How do you know that name? I found a book, she said, and a photograph of a woman with my face. Something moved through him then, some current of emotion he could not fully cage, and for a moment the silver in his eyes burned so bright it did not look human at all. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold morning air, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. 20 years ago, my father and Victor Lane led our forces north, he said. I was a boy. I was told the Ashfords had betrayed the peace, that they had turned dangerous, that what happened was tragic but necessary. That is the story I was raised on. That is the story carved into every history in this house. He paused, and his hands curled into fists at his sides. And then 2 weeks ago, a waitress drank wolfsbane meant for me, and survived it, wearing the Ashford moon around her neck. Which means at least one part of the story I was raised on is a lie. And if one part is a lie, Grace, then maybe all of it is. They stood there in the cold, the enormity of it hanging between them, and then Grace felt it, truly felt it, for the first time. A pull, low and deep, like a rope, tied somewhere behind her heart, with the other end tied behind his. It frightened her more than the poison had. From the way Damon suddenly stepped back, from the way he dragged a hand through his hair and turned half away, she knew with absolute certainty that he felt it too, and that it terrified him just the same. Whatever this is, he said quietly, not looking at her, it is not possible. You understand that. My family and yours are fire and water. Whoever destroyed the North will not stop at one poisoned cup, and if they learn what you are before I learn who they are, no wall I build will be tall enough. Then learn faster, Grace said. He looked at her then, and for the first time since the banquet, Damon Cross smiled. It was small, and it was tired, but it was real. That evening, the estate hosted a dinner for the inner families, and Damon insisted Grace attend. Hiding you makes you look like a secret, he said. Secrets get hunted, guests get protected. So Grace put on a deep blue gown that a maid swore matched her eyes, tucked the pendant beneath the neckline, and walked into a room full of the most dangerous people in the country, wearing the steadiest face she owned. It went wrong within the hour. Victor Lane found her by the windows. Up close he was all warmth and grandfather charm, gold ring gleaming, red stone winking in the candlelight. He pressed a glass of cider into her hand and toasted her courage. He asked about her recovery, her childhood, her family, each question soft as a pillow and aimed like an arrow. Grace gave him the story Damon had built for her. No family, weak dose, lucky girl. Victor smiled and nodded and watched her with eyes that did not match his mouth. You know, he said pleasantly, it is the strangest thing. I have seen wolfsbane poisonings before, long ago, in the north. Terrible business. He swirled his drink slowly. The dose in that cup was measured by a professional. I saw the autopsy report on the wine myself. There was nothing weak about it. He leaned in, and his voice stayed warm and gentle, even as the words turned to ice. So either the report is wrong, my dear, or you are a walking miracle. And I have lived long enough to know that miracles, always have bloodlines. Grace's heart slammed against her ribs. Across the room, Damon's head turned toward them sharply, as if he had heard her pulse spike from 40 feet away, through a crowd of 200 people. I am just a waitress, Grace said. Victor Lane smiled, and for one unguarded instant, something ancient and cold looked out through his eyes. Of course you are, he said. Just like your mother was just a gardener's daughter. She had your exact smile, you know. He set down his glass with a soft click. Lovely woman. Such a pity about the fire. He walked away into the crowd, leaving Grace frozen by the window, with her blood turned to ice water, because he had just told her everything, and confessed to nothing, and they both knew it. He knew who she was. He had known her mother. He had been there. And now he knew that she knew. Across the room, Helen Marsh watched the whole exchange over the rim of her glass, her winter smile slowly widening, like a woman watching a chess piece move exactly where she wanted it. Grace did not tell Damon what Victor had said. She wanted to. Twice that night she started toward his study, and twice she stopped in the corridor with her hand raised to knock, because a thought had lodged itself in her mind like a splinter, and it would not come out. Damon's own father had led the forces north. Damon had been raised inside the lie. What if some part of him needed the lie to stay standing? What if, when the choice finally came between the truth and his family's name, he chose his blood over hers? So she stayed silent, and the silence cost her. 3 nights later, the estate held its monthly gathering under the full moon. Grace was told to remain in the main house with the doors locked, and for the first time, no one pretended to explain why. From her window she watched the families walk out across the lawns toward the forest in the silver light, dozens of them, silent and purposeful, and she watched them pass into the trees, and she watched what came out the other side. Shapes, huge, graceful, impossible shapes, moving through the moonlight like smoke given muscle and bone. One of them, larger and darker than all the rest, stopped at the forest's edge and turned its head toward her window, and its eyes were gray, ringed with burning silver. Grace pressed her hand flat against the cold glass, and the thing behind her ribs, the thing that had paced there her whole life, rose up and pressed back against the inside of her skin, so hard that she gasped and gripped the windowsill. Her vision sharpened until she could see individual pine needles 100 yards away. Her hearing cracked open like a door, and the whole night poured in, wind and owls and a heartbeat that was not hers, steady and deep, calling from the tree line. Then it passed, and she was only a woman at a window again, shaking, with 10 small crescent marks pressed into the wooden sill where her fingertips had gripped it. Not fingernail marks, something sharper. She was still staring at them when the screaming started. It came from the east lawn, high and raw, a sound of pure fear. Grace was out of her room before she had made any decision to move, down the stairs. Through the side door she was absolutely forbidden to open, into the cold silver night. Later she would not be able to explain why. She would only remember the pull, the rope behind her heart yanked so violently that not running was never an option. She found the scene at the garden's edge. A young maid stood frozen against the hedge wall, white as chalk, and between her and the house paced a wolf that Grace had never seen among the others. It was thin and gray and wrong, its movements jerky, its eyes rolling and wild, foam at its jaws. Even Grace, who knew nothing of this world, could see that something inside it had broken. It was not hunting. It was lost in some private madness, and the maid was simply in its path. Grace stepped between them. She would never be able to explain that either. Her body simply moved, planting itself in front of the trembling girl, and the wild wolf's rolling eyes locked onto her. It went still, its lips pulled back, and it charged. Time went strange. Grace heard her own heartbeat, slow and enormous. She heard Damon's roar from somewhere impossibly far across the grounds, a sound no human throat could make, and she heard, clearest of all, a voice from that deep place inside her, calm as still water, speaking as if it had been waiting 24 years for exactly this moment. "Stand your ground," the voice said. "You are an Ashford. Wolves of the north do not kneel." Grace looked into the charging animal's eyes, and did not move, and something poured out of her, something invisible and vast, a pressure, a command, the sheer weight of a bloodline that had once governed every wild thing north of the mountains. The wild wolf broke stride, its legs buckled. 10 feet from her, it stopped completely, dropped its head, flattened its ears, and lowered its shaking body to the grass at her feet in absolute surrender. The garden went silent. The maid had stopped screaming, and Grace stood over a submitting wolf in the full moonlight, her pendant blazing cold against her skin, having just done something in front of a dozen emerging witnesses that no ordinary human, and no ordinary wolf, could ever do. Damon reached her seconds later, human again, a coat thrown around his shoulders, his face like a storm about to break. Behind him, figures were gathering at the tree line, staring. Grace saw Helen Marsh among them, a robe clutched at her throat, her face for once stripped of all its winter charm, and filled instead with pure, naked shock. And beyond Helen, half in shadow, stood Victor Lane, And he was not shocked at all. He was studying Grace, the way a man studies a problem he has just decided must be removed, and then he turned and walked calmly back into the dark. Damon took Grace's arm and steered her inside without a word. Only when they reached his study, with the door bolted and the curtains drawn, did he let go, and his hands, she noticed, were trembling. "Do you understand what you just did?" he said quietly. "I stopped it. You commanded it." He turned to face her, and there was awe in his eyes, and fear, and something far warmer that he was failing completely to hide. "A sick wolf in full madness does not stop for anything, Grace. Not for me. Not for anyone alive today. The only ones who ever had that gift, the voice that wild things obey, were the Northern line. It was their birthright. It is in every old story about them. And you just used it on my lawn, in front of half the inner families." The room seemed to shrink. Grace sank into a chair. "So they know," she whispered. "They suspect," Damon said. "By morning, they will know." He crouched in front of her chair so their eyes were level, and he took her cold hands in his warm ones, and the rope behind her heart pulled so hard it ached. "Listen to me. Everything is different now. Whoever burned the North 20 years ago did it to erase your family's claim, and tonight you stood under a full moon and proved the claim is still alive. You are no longer a witness who needs protecting. You are a threat to a 20-year-old lie, and the person who built that lie is inside these walls." Grace looked down at their joined hands. "Then tell me the truth," she said. "All of it. Because Victor Lane knew my mother, Damon. He told me so at the dinner, with a smile on his face. He called her death a pity. And I said nothing to you, because I was afraid of what you might choose, if the trail led back to your own father." Damon went completely still. For a long moment, the only sound was the fire. Then he stood, walked to his desk, unlocked the bottom drawer, and lifted out a worn folder with a crescent moon stamped on its cover. He set it in her lap, like a man setting down a weight he had carried for years. "My father died believing the North betrayed us," he said. "I have spent 2 weeks pulling every thread of that story, and every single thread runs through one man's hands. The orders, the evidence, the autopsy seals, the fire report, all of it written, filed, and witnessed by Victor Lane." He drew a slow breath. "My father was not the architect, Grace. He was the weapon. Someone aimed him. And I think your family died because they discovered something about Victor that he could not allow to live." Grace opened the folder with shaking fingers. Inside were photographs, reports, maps of the Northern Territory. And on the very top, in handwriting that was elegant and cold, a single old memo, dated 3 days before the fire. It read, "The Northern problem resolves itself this week. Afterward, the mines and everything beneath them transfer to my administration. Ensure the child is accounted for. No loose threads." Signed with the initials VL. "Ensure the child is accounted for." Grace touched the words, and the thing behind her ribs began, very quietly, to growl. The memo was proof, but it was not enough proof. Damon explained it grimly, as the fire burned low. Among the old families, accusations against a man like Victor Lane required more than paper. Paper could be forged, and Victor would stand before the council and say exactly that. And half of them owed him favors, going back 30 years. To bring him down, they needed something that could not be argued with. They needed the blood test. That was Dr. Hart's secret work, the proof he had promised Grace in the dark library. There existed an old rite, the doctor explained the next morning, half science and half ceremony, by which a bloodline could be confirmed beyond all challenge. A drop of Grace's blood, a preserved relic of the Ashford line, and a council witness. If the two bloods recognized each other, the crescent would rise on her skin for all to see, and no law in their world could deny her name. The relic existed, a lock of hair from the Ashford Alpha, her father, sealed in the council archives along with relics of every ruling line. The archives, of course, sat in the council house in the city, and the keeper of the council house, for the past 20 years, was Victor Lane. "He built the lock around the only key that can expose him," Damon said. "That is how careful this man is." "Then we do not ask for the key," Grace said. "We take it." The plan came together over 4 tense days. The council's midwinter session would fill the council house with every family head in the region. Too many eyes for Victor to act openly. During the session, Dr. Hart, who as a physician of the old families still held archive privileges, would retrieve the relic under the pretense of a records review. Damon would keep Victor pinned in the chamber, with a long procedural dispute. Grace would wait at the estate, guarded, invisible, patient. It was a good plan, and it lasted exactly 9 hours. The night before the session, a maid brought Grace a supper tray, and pinned beneath the teapot was a note in elegant, cold handwriting. Grace's blood turned to ice before she finished the first line. I have the old doctor. He was clever, but he is slow, and he talks in his sleep. If you wish him to see morning, come to the east service gate at midnight. Come alone. Tell the king, and there will be nothing left to find. You have my word that I only wish to talk, and unlike everyone else in this house, my dear, I have never once lied to you. VL. Grace sat with the note in her shaking hands, and the war inside her lasted 1 full hour. Every sensible voice said go to Damon, and against all of them stood one image, gray-haired Dr. Hart, the first person in this world who had been kind to her, who had kept her secret at the risk of his life, who had known her mother, sitting alone somewhere, with his life hanging on her choice. Victor had chosen his hostage with a surgeon's precision. At midnight, Grace walked to the east service gate alone. They were waiting for her, 3 silent men and a black car, and the drive wound north for 2 hours into forested hills, until the paved roads gave up. When the door finally opened, Grace stepped out into a cold that smelled of pine and old smoke, and her breath stopped. Ruins rose around her in the moonlight, charred timber skeletons, a collapsed great hall, a stone chimney standing alone like a grave marker. She did not need to be told where she was. Her blood told her. The thing behind her ribs pressed against her skin, and made a sound she had never heard from it before, a long, low sound of grief. Victor had brought her home, to the burned bones of the Ashford territory. He stood in what had been the great hall, lamplight glowing around him, Dr. Hart seated on a stone nearby, pale and bruised but alive. Victor turned as Grace approached, and smiled his grandfather's smile in the ruins of everything he had destroyed. I wanted you to see it, he said pleasantly. Before the end, I felt I owed your family that much. Why? Grace said. It was the only question that mattered. Why did you do it? And Victor Lane, 20 years silent, finally talked, because a man only confesses to an audience he intends to erase. He talked about the northern mines and what truly lay beneath them. Veins of silver ore, unlike any in the world, worth more than every family fortune combined. He talked about how Grace's father had discovered Victor's secret surveys, how the Ashford Alpha had planned to bring the evidence south to the council, how Victor had reached the old king first, with 20 years of carefully planted lies about northern treachery. The fire had been set the night before her father could travel. The child, the loose thread, had vanished before the flames rose, spirited away by a nursemaid Victor spent years quietly hunting. I found the nursemaid eventually, Victor said. She never talked. Loyal to the end, that one. But I never found the child. And then, 20 years later, a waitress drinks a cup of wolfsbane in front of 200 witnesses and simply does not die. He shook his head, almost fondly. All that searching, and you delivered yourself to me on a serving tray. The poison was never for Damon, Grace said slowly, understanding blooming like ice in her chest. It was a test. You suspected me already. Clever girl, Victor said. I have known what you might be since the day the hotel hired you. Your mother's face is not an easy thing to forget. The cup was placed where a thirsty, overworked girl would grab it. If you died, you were no one, and I lost nothing. If you lived, I had my answer. He spread his hands, and afterward, our lovesick king locked the answer safely inside his own house for me, and even began to fall for it, which was more than I dared hope. A king distracted is a king blind. Grace's hands curled into fists. And now? Now, Victor said. The story ends the way it was always going to end. The lost Ashford heir, mad with grief, returns to her family's ruins, harms the poor old doctor who tried to help her, and is tragically lost. The last thread cut. At last. He sighed, almost with regret. Nothing personal, my dear. Your family simply stood on top of something I wanted. He raised his hand to signal his men. And that was the moment 3 things happened at once. Dr. Hart surged up from his stone and hurled the burning lamp at the nearest man, shouting her name. From the black tree line came a sound that shook snow from the ruined timbers. the roar of something enormous arriving at full speed, because Damon Cross had found the note Grace had deliberately left unfolded on her pillow, and he had been running north for 2 hours. And inside Grace, at the sight of the lamp flying and the old man being seized, the door behind her ribs, that had been sealed her entire life, did not open. It shattered. Fire poured through her, but this fire was hers. Her bones sang. Her senses exploded outward. The moonlight turned bright as noon, and the world dropped away below her, as her body remade itself in a single blazing heartbeat, into the shape it had been waiting 24 years to take. Where Grace Palmer had stood, a wolf now stood in the ruins of the north, a wolf with fur of pure silver, the sacred color of the Ashford line, the color out of the old stories, the color no living wolf had worn since the fire. Victor Lane's men froze where they stood, and for the first time in 20 years, in the ashes of the family he had erased, Victor Lane's smile disappeared, and what replaced it was fear. The silver wolf looked at him with her mother's eyes, and took one slow step forward. Everything after that happened very fast. Victor's men broke first. They were hired hands, not believers, and no amount of pay covers standing in a burned ruin at midnight, between a silver wolf out of legend, and the furious black shape of the Alpha King exploding from the tree line. 2 of them simply ran. The third dropped to the ground with his hands over his head, and stayed there. Dr. Hart scrambled clear of the fallen lamp, beating out the small flames with his coat, shouting for everyone to see reason. Victor did not run. That was the thing about him, Grace would think later. Even exposed, even cornered, he reached not for escape, but for control. He pulled a small glass vial from his coat. Wolfsbane, enough for both wolves before him, and he held it up like a man holding a sermon. "One more fire," he said calmly. "One more tragedy. I have talked my way out of worse rooms than this." He never got to open it. Grace moved without thinking, the command rising out of her the way it had in the garden, but 100 times stronger now, carried on her true voice. The pressure of the northern bloodline rolled across the ruins like a wave, the voice that wild things obey, and Victor Lane was, beneath all his suits and smiles, exactly what everyone in that hidden world was. His own body betrayed him. His knees buckled against every order his mind was screaming, and the vial dropped from his numb fingers and rolled away, unopened across the scorched stone. And then Damon was on him, human again, wrenching his arms back, binding his wrists with the cord from his own fine coat. It should have felt like an ending. It did not. Because as Damon hauled Victor upright, the old man began to laugh, softly, horribly, with real amusement. "You think this finishes it?" he said. "You beautiful fools. Do you imagine I built 20 years of empire on my own signature? Check the seals on the fire report, boy. Check who witnessed my orders and notarized my claims, and voted my appointments through council, session after session. I did not corrupt your world alone. I merely organized it." He turned his bruised smile on Grace. "Take me to trial, little heir. Please, watch how many of the judges I own." They drove south through the dawn in grim silence, Victor bound in the rear vehicle, Dr. Hart wrapped in blankets, Grace human again in Damon's coat, staring at the fire report folder open on her lap. Victor had not been bluffing. There, witnessing the false account of the northern fire, was a second signature, elegant and looping, and Grace's heart dropped through the floor of the car when she read the name. Marsh. Not Helen. Helen's father. The head of the Marsh family, the second most powerful house in the region, whose daughter had been groomed since childhood to marry the king. "The mines," Damon said quietly, watching the road. The Marsh fortune tripled in the decade after the fire. Everyone assumed it was shrewd investing. He closed his eyes briefly. It was northern silver. They have been quietly emptying your family's mountains for 20 years, and a marsh queen beside a blind king would have kept it flowing forever. That is why Helen was always pushed at me. Not love, not even ambition, cover. "So when we walk into that council house," Grace said, "we are not accusing one man. We are accusing the foundation of half the room." "Yes," Damon said. "And they will destroy us with procedure," she said. "They will demand proof no one can argue with." "Yes," Damon said again, and he almost smiled. "So it is fortunate that we are driving directly to the archives, and that the keeper of the archives is currently tied up in the car behind us, and that his keys are in my pocket." The council house rose out of the morning mist, old stone and older law, and the midwinter session was already assembling, family heads streaming through the great doors in dark winter coats. Word flew ahead of them the way word always does. By the time Damon Cross walked into the marble hall with a bound Victor Lane, a bruised doctor, and an unknown young woman at his side, the chamber was full and roaring. What followed was the most dangerous hour of Grace's life, and not one drop of blood was spilled in it. It was fought entirely with words and paper and nerve. Victor, even bound, was magnificent and terrible. He denied everything with wounded dignity. He called the memo a forgery, the ruins visit a kidnapping staged by Damon, the doctor a senile old man, and Grace, an imposter, coached by a king who had lost his mind over a serving girl. And exactly as he had promised, voices around the chamber rose to defend him, Marsh loudest among them, demanding the session dismiss this circus. Then Dr. Hart stood, and in a voice that shook only slightly, invoked the old right of blood. The right of any claimant, under laws older than every person in the room, to be tested against the relics of a fallen line before the full council. It could not be refused. Even Victor's allies could not refuse it. Refusing the right meant admitting fear of its answer. The relic was brought up from the archive vaults in a sealed silver case, a small braided lock of dark hair, all that officially remained of the Ashford Alpha. The chamber fell so silent, Grace could hear her own heart. She stepped onto the speaker's floor alone, 500 eyes on her, and Dr. Hart pricked her finger, and one drop of her blood touched the relic of the father she had never known. For one endless second, nothing happened. Then light climbed her arm. The crescent rose beneath her skin, silver and unmistakable, glowing from wrist to shoulder, and above it her eyes turned to bright burning moonlight for the whole chamber to see, and somewhere outside the council house, though it was the middle of the morning, every wolf within 10 miles lifted its head and howled at once. The chamber came apart, not in violence, in something stranger, in a wave of rising bodies, in old family heads standing one after another, some in shock, some in shame, some in open weeping, because the North had been beloved once, before the lie, and its heir stood alive in front of them, wearing the sacred silver of her line. The Marsh patriarch tried to reach the doors, and found them blocked by council guards who no longer answered to his favors. Helen simply sat frozen in the gallery, 20 years of her family's architecture collapsing around her ears in a single morning. And through all of it, Victor Lane stood bound in the center of the floor, watching his empire disassemble itself, and Grace saw the exact moment the calculation behind his eyes finally ran out of moves. The council's judgment came before nightfall. Every seal Victor had touched in 20 years would be reopened. The Marsh accounts were frozen to the last coin. The Northern Territory, its lands, its ruins, and every ounce of silver beneath its mountains, was restored in full to the last living Ashford, effective immediately, by unanimous vote. The eldest councilwoman, a tiny ancient woman who had known Grace's grandmother, closed the session with her cane raised for silence, and addressed Grace directly before the assembled families. "The council owes the North a debt that cannot be paid," she said, "but it can begin. Tell us, heir of Ashford, what is the first thing you require of us?" And Grace, who 3 weeks earlier had been carrying trays through a hotel kitchen, looked at the most powerful gathering in the country waiting on her word, and found that her voice was perfectly steady. "The truth," she said, "published. Every page of it, in every record, under my family's real name. My parents were called traitors for 20 years. Before you give me back 1 acre or 1 coin, you will give them back their honor." The chamber rose again, and this time, it rose for her. The truth, once released, moved through the region like spring floodwater. Within a week, the corrected histories were printed and posted in every territory hall. Within 2, letters began arriving at the Cross estate, addressed simply to the Ashford heir, hundreds of them, from old northern families scattered south after the fire, from elders who had known her parents, from a retired schoolteacher who still had her mother's childhood drawings, from strangers who wrote only to say that they had never believed the lie, not for 1 day in 20 years, and that they had wept when the bells rang. One letter changed everything. It came in a worn envelope with no return address, written in a careful, elderly hand, and it began with the words, "You will not remember me, but I carried you through the snow the night the North burned, the nursemaid, alive, the loyal one Victor had hunted and never broken." Her name was Margaret Wells. She was 71 years old, and she had spent 2 decades in a small coastal town under a borrowed name, checking the papers every single week for news of a dark-haired girl with a crescent pendant. Grace drove to the coast the very next morning, and when the small white cottage door opened, the old woman took one look at her face, said, "Oh, you have her eyes, exactly her eyes," and the two of them stood on the doorstep holding each other, while the sea wind blew, and for the first time in her life, Grace heard true stories of her parents, from someone who had loved them. How her father laughed too loudly in solemn meetings, how her mother could calm any frightened animal in the territory just by humming, how they had argued cheerfully for a month over what to name their daughter, and had finally chosen the northern word for light. Not Grace, her real name, her first name, the one spoken over her cradle. Margaret wrote it out for her on a slip of paper in the old northern script, and Grace carried it in her pocket for days, like an ember that did not burn. Meanwhile, the reckoning ground forward. Victor Lane faced the full tribunal of the United Families, and with his seals broken open, the scale of him finally came into the light, not just the North. Falsified successions in 2 smaller territories. A judge's convenient retirement. Bribery threaded through 30 years of council votes. The tribunal stripped him of every title, every property, and every drop of standing, and sentenced him under the oldest law of their world, the sentence reserved for those who turn on their own kind. Exile. Total and permanent. His name struck from every registry. Escorted to the far border, and released alone, into lands where no pack would ever take him in, and no door would ever open to his knock. For a creature built entirely of connections, influence, and control, it was the one punishment worse than any cell. Grace attended the final session. She owed herself that. Victor was brought through the chamber one last time, gray and diminished in a plain coat, and as he passed her seat, he paused, and the old cold intelligence flickered up one final time. "I only ever lost to accidents," he said quietly. 20 years of design, undone, because a tired girl grabbed the wrong cup. He shook his head slowly, almost marveling. "Remember that. When they call you chosen, you were thirsty. That is all history is." "Maybe," Grace said. She met his eyes without flinching. "But my mother would have said the moon puts the cup where it means to." She let the silence sit for a moment. "I am choosing to believe my mother." They took him out through the great doors, and the doors closed, and that chapter of the world was over. The Marsh family fell more quietly. The patriarch followed Victor into exile. The family's stolen wealth, every coin traceable to northern silver, transferred to the restored Ashford estate. And Helen, who investigators cleared of any knowledge of the fire itself, though not of years of smaller schemes, appeared at the Cross estate one gray afternoon, asking to speak with Grace alone. The staff expected venom. Instead, the 2 women walked the winter gardens for an hour, and what Helen offered was not quite an apology, and not quite a confession, but something rawer, the account of a girl raised from birth, as an instrument of her father's design, pointed at a throne like an arrow, and never once asked what she wanted. "I was told my whole life that you people were the enemy," Helen said at the garden gate. "Northern savages who betrayed us. I built myself on it." She laughed once, without any humor. "And it turns out, I was the daughter of the betrayal. Everything I was cruel to you about, I was actually describing my own house." "What will you do now?" Grace asked. Helen looked out at the winter trees for a long moment. "I genuinely have no idea," she said. "And it is the first honest sentence I have ever spoken to you. I think I might start there." She left for the southern coast that spring, and the letters she later sent Grace were, against every possible expectation, the beginning of something almost like friendship. Through all of it, through the tribunals and the letters and the slow rebuilding, there remained the matter of Damon Cross, and the rope tied behind 2 hearts, which neither of them had spoken of since the night the North burned for the second time in their lives, this time with truth instead of fire. He had given her the whole winter, space, counsel when she asked, distance when she needed it, and never once a single claim on her. But Grace was not blind. She saw what it cost him. She felt the pull every hour of every day, felt his presence through walls, woke knowing which wing of the house he was in. The bond was real, older than both of them, and it terrified her for one specific reason. She finally spoke aloud on the last night of winter, finding him in his study past midnight, the fire low. "I need to know something," she said, and he set down his papers immediately. because he always did. This pull between us. If I walk north in the spring and rebuild my family's territory and never come back, what happens to you? Then I govern the South, Damon said quietly. And I miss you for the rest of my life, and it changes nothing about your right to go. That is what I needed to know, Grace said. That it is a door and not a chain. Her voice softened. Because I watched my whole life get decided by other people, Damon. The fire decided. Victor decided. Even the poison decided. If I ever stand beside you, it will not be because a bond decided. It will be because I did. Damon rose from his chair. Crossing the room, he stopped in front of her, and the silver rings in his gray eyes were brighter than the fire. Then let me say it plainly. With no bond, and no thrones anywhere in it, he said. You are the bravest person I have ever known. You walked into ruin for an old man who was kind to you. You remade the law of this land in one morning with one drop of blood. And I have loved you, I think, since the moment you stood on a marble floor with poison in your body, and tried to apologize for it. He held out his hand, open, palm up, asking, not taking. Go north, Grace. Rebuild your home. Take a year, take 10, and if you ever choose me, on your own terms, in your own time, I will be here. Grace looked at the open hand for a long moment. Then she took it, and held it, and said, Ask me again at midsummer, in the north, under my family's sky. And the smile that broke across the face of the most feared man in the country was, the fire could confirm, entirely helpless. The north came back to life, the way frozen rivers do, slowly at first, then all at once. Grace went home in the first week of spring, and she did not go alone. The scattered northern families followed her, first in dozens, then in hundreds, wagons and trucks winding up the mountain roads loaded with tools and timber, and children who had grown up on southern streets hearing bedtime stories about a homeland they had never seen. Margaret Wells rode in the lead vehicle beside Grace, directing the rebuilding from memory. This is where the market stood. The school was there by the birches. Your mother's garden ran along that south wall. Catch the sun. Dr. Hart came north too, claiming his old bones wanted mountain air, and reopened the territory's first clinic in 40 years. The council, still tender with its guilt, sent engineers, funds, and craftsmen. The reclaimed marsh silver, the very wealth stolen from beneath these mountains, paid to raise the Great Hall again, on its original stones. And Grace insisted on one change to the old design, wider doors and longer tables, because the north she intended to build would be in the business of welcoming, not walling out. She learned to govern the way she had learned everything, by working herself to the bone, and refusing to pretend she knew things she did not. She sat with elders for hours, absorbing the old laws. She walked the mine tunnels with the engineers. She settled a boundary dispute between two stubborn farming families by making both parties dig the new fence line together, which left them so united in their complaints about her that they became friends by autumn, exactly as she had intended. The people watched all of it. They had expected a symbol, a sad, beautiful air to wave at festivals. What they got was a woman who had carried trays through double shifts for 6 years, and knew precisely how it felt when powerful people looked through you, and who therefore looked through no one. By midsummer, the wolves of the north ran their own mountains again under their own moon, and the sound of them singing across the valleys at night made old people stand in their doorways and cry. And at midsummer, as promised, Damon Cross came north. He arrived not as a king but as a guest, with no procession and no crown, driving himself up the mountain road with the windows down. Grace met him at the rebuilt gates of her family's hall, and the whole territory found urgent business in the vicinity of those gates that afternoon. Repairs that needed doing, herbs that needed gathering, absolutely essential fence inspections, all within eyeshot. Northern people, Grace had learned by then, were shameless. She showed him everything. The hall, the school, the clinic, her mother's garden replanted along the south wall, already unruly with summer roses. They walked up through the high meadow as the light went long and gold, to a flat stone at the ridgeline, where you could see the whole territory at once, every rooftop and river of it. And it was there, under her family sky, exactly as she had asked, that Damon Cross turned to her, and asked again. He did not kneel like a suitor in a story. He stood facing her as an equal, which she found she preferred infinitely, and he asked her to build something that had never existed before, Not a queen absorbed into the south, not territories merely allied by marriage, but two lines joined with both names kept alive, north and south as full partners, her seat in her own hall, his in his, and a family, if they were lucky, raised belonging to both mountains and marble. Grace listened to all of it with her eyes on the valley her parents had died for, and her heart hammering in the ridiculous way it always did around him, bond or no bond, and when he finished, she let the wind hold the silence for a moment, purely to watch him sweat, because some joys in life should not be rushed. "Ask me the short way," she said. Damon laughed, and the sound rolled down the meadow. "Grace Palmer of Ashford," he said. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," said Grace, and the wind carried it, and from somewhere down the valley, where absolutely no one was supposed to be listening, an entire hidden crowd of shameless northerners erupted into cheering, and startled birds rose off the ridge in a spiral, and that was how the whole world found out at once. The wedding was held at the turn of autumn, in the rebuilt Great Hall with its wider doors, and those doors stood open all day. It was said afterward that no gathering like it had ever happened, north and south under one roof, the council elders and the coastal families. Helen Marsh, arriving from the south with a gift and a genuinely nervous smile, and leaving with 3 new friendships, Margaret Wells given the seat of honor a mother would have held, and Dr. Hart, who walked Grace down the long aisle, weeping so openly that 3 separate elders had to pass him handkerchiefs, having earned that walk in a dark library the night he first chose her over his own safety. Grace wore silver and blue, her mother's colors from the old records. At her throat, where it had hung through poverty and poison and fire, and everything after, sat the small crescent pendant, the only thing her mother had ever given her, and the thing that had, in the end, given her everything back. Near the close of the ceremony came the northern custom of the shared cup, an old blessing, where 2 families drink from one vessel to seal their joining. When the moment arrived, the hall grew oddly quiet, and a few guests glanced at each other, because everyone knew the story. Everyone in that room knew exactly how all of it had begun. Grace lifted the wedding cup and looked out at all of them, and then at Damon, whose eyes had gone bright. "The last time I picked up a cup that was not mine," she said, and the hall was already beginning to laugh. "I got poison, a king, a family, a homeland, a war, and a wedding." She turned the cup slowly in her hands. "So I want you all to be very aware of what I am capable of, and to watch your drinks around me at every festival for the rest of our lives." The hall roared, and when the laughter finally settled, she spoke the quiet part, the true part, in the direction of the 2 portraits newly hung above the great hearth, a tall man with kind eyes, and a dark-haired woman with Grace's exact smile. "I was thirsty," she said softly. "That is all it was, in the beginning. I was tired, and I was thirsty, and I was invisible, and I reached for the wrong cup." She looked up at the painted faces of the parents she had finally, truly met. "But Mama always said the moon puts the cup where it means to. So this is for you, and for everyone who is exhausted and unseen, and carrying someone else's tray tonight, wondering if their life will ever be more than this. Keep going. You have no idea what you are one small accident away from becoming." Then she drank, and passed the cup to Damon, and he drank, and the bells of the rebuilt North rang out across the valley for the first time in 20 years, ringing for a wedding, ringing for a homecoming, ringing for a waitress from the east side who grabbed the wrong cup on a marble floor, and, seconds after the poison hit her stomach, began the long, impossible, wonderful accident of finding out exactly who she had been all along. And high above the sound of the bells, over the mountains her family ruled once more. The moon rose full and silver, looking, everyone in the valley later agreed, extremely pleased with itself.